Welcome back. 100 years ago, the Carnegie Foundation gave Salt Lake City $15,000 to build a library to stand throughout time. The foundation was so enthused with the project, it added another $10,000, and it turned out to be a good investment because that facility is still going strong. Tonight, Craig Wirth visits the Chapman Library, an iconic anchor on Salt Lake City's west side. It's tonight's Wirth Watching.
It was 1918, and Salt Lake City's Carnegie Library was opened with great fanfare. Mayor Montferry said that the library stands for a bigger and better citizenship. A free library in almost every town was the goal of the Carnegie Foundation, and this was one of the best. It would be named for Annie Chapman, the city's first librarian. It would serve the new West Side, a neighborhood called Poplar Grove, a residential neighborhood of workers and new immigrants, a third of them who worked for Utah's giant rail industry. And today, 100 years later, the Chapman branch on 9th West and 6th South still anchors this neighborhood, and that's something to celebrate. Oh, and they did celebrate.
It's an institution. It was meant to be that way. They built it to look like something that should last for millennia. It's lasted 100 years now.
But it's more than how it looks in its beauty. It's what's inside the space. And it's more than books. It's a place they have always met after school or on the weekends. A friendly place and a place to study, read, and learn. The West Side continued to grow. Much of that growth was just after the library opened that May Day in 1918. And as more and more people moved here from all over, they needed a place to gather, and the Chapman Library was perfect. There was the Chapman Civic Club, and the place where you got the latest novel. And that's why people still gather here. The neighborhood is now growing up from the days when there were open fields. They no longer work for the rails, but there is still the Chapman branch. And again, why they celebrate it, that's why they remembered Annie Chapman.
This is a prime example of what it means to celebrate someone from 100 years ago who was a woman and was leading in this whole system of library service.
It's a neighborhood place, but also a good place to just see if you've never discovered this treasure before. Well, 100 years ago, it was built to serve the neighborhood. And you know, 100 years later, the Chapman Library is still serving the neighborhood. Craig Wirth, News for Utah.
The Chapman branch is on the National Register of Historic Places as a prime example of classical revival architecture. Famous Utah architect Don Carlos Young Jr. designed the 8,000 square foot building. He had just designed the layout for the University of Utah campus prior to designing that library.